Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, PBM, Customers Bank, Collins Building Services, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Marks Paneth, Capital One Bank. Additional funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from Amerant Bank, Bank of America, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties LLC Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott Inc., Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Catsimatidis Red Apple Group, Keysight Capital Partners, New Banks, Meridian Capital Group, Ocean First Bank, People's United Bank, RPW Group, TD Bank, and these friends. Wow, lots of development taking place in Westchester and Connecticut. Who's doing it? Who's lending? Who's building? So today, with the help of my executive producer, Joe Graviosi, we have a dynamic group of individuals talking about developments taking place specifically in Westchester and Connecticut. We may even discuss New Jersey, since all of the guys seem to be involved a little bit in New Jersey. My guests today include somebody who joined me in 2007, Greg Ballou, who is the divisional president for New York Metro at Lennar Multifamily Communities. Joe Graviosi, who is the senior vice president, residential development at RXR Realty. Privy Mohan, who is the vice president, commercial real estate, Capital One. And last but not least, Russell Tepper, who's a senior managing director, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, for Mill Creek Residential. Thanks for all being here. And Joe, thank you very much for bringing all these people together.
My pleasure,
I'm
Michael.
going to start a little different. The guy who has the money, why he's lending in Westchester and Stamford.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. I think and it's something we're going to touch on throughout the show, I'm sure. But yeah, the transit-oriented story isn't a new one. It's been around for quite some time. As long as there are major metros and affordability issues, you have certainly development and the demand to live sort of outside of those cities. So as we looked at take Westchester as an example. I think you have a tremendous, story there with respect to the transit, but even beyond that, the lack of, supply for a very, extended period of time, still relative value, if you think about other, transit-oriented stops that people could be at in call it Jersey or Brooklyn. And finally, I think just a, increasingly attractive Grand Central and sort of Park Avenue hub. I think put those things together. I think there's a tremendous, still runway for growth, even despite some of the, the recent supply in the market. So, we look to that as we look at any other market and understand, what's the structural attractiveness and, how do we play there? And I think we like what we see.
I think this is a question for Greg and Russell. You're both national operations. You have operations in many states, all different cities. Okay, how the companies decide to concentrate specifically in Westchester and certain parts of Stamford, as for this market over there, as opposed to spending more time in New Jersey, which I know, Russell, you're rather active in New Jersey in different places. But why Westchester today? Greg, Russell?
I guess since I got called first, I'll go. But we're definitely involved pretty heavily in New Jersey, no question. But Westchester County and Fairfield County are also very attractive. Our business plan for some time now has been to operate a little bit more around the periphery of New York City. I mean, we like a lot of developers spend time in New York City, but I would say as of a couple of years ago, in our minds, it just became less and less attractive as the regulatory risk increased, as we saw, of course, problems arising in the pandemic. But our approach really has been more to find locations that are more, quasi-urban, call it urban suburban, and focus on those areas where you really do have a solid commuter population. You have arts, entertainment, restaurants, et cetera, business centers with employees, a lot of daytime populations. And as you mentioned, these areas really do provide great value and a good cost alternative to New York City. So when you have these towns like White Plains or like Stamford as an example, that have easy commutes into the city for those that are commuting into the city, even now on a more limited basis, it's still a great value proposition and just makes a ton of sense. And on top of everything else, it's less competitive to find sites. It's a little bit easier to make the deals pencil, et cetera. So I think that there are a lot of reasons for us as a national developer why that is a solid business plan.
Russell?
Sure. Thank you for having me this morning. I would say that the most important attraction for us are the people, the labor pool, those that want to live in the New York metro area and do not want to necessarily live in New York City and don't necessarily work in New York City, but want to be close to the hub where there's enormous labor opportunities, enormous capital investment, great cultural opportunity, significant diversity, and focus on social governance, while there's also a balance of economic diversity, fiscal growth, and a real desire to invest, work, and live in this area. We've been developing in this area for many, many, many years, as we have in, as you mentioned, other submarkets around the country. But the New York metro area has been very well insulated from volatility in the economy and remains a very large focus for Mill Creek.
What's very interesting looking at your websites, many of you are, as I said, in Westchester and also in Stamford. Some of you have been involved in Long Island, but it doesn't look like too many of you have been involved with New York City specifically, with the exception of RXR. Why do you prefer the suburbs as opposed to New York City?
We actually are working on one particular development opportunity in one of the outer boroughs. But to your point, Michael, it has not been a primary focus of ours. New York City is another world unto its own as it relates to real estate development and the risk-adjusted returns and decisions that need to be made in certain timely fashions in New York City that don't exist in northern New Jersey or on Long Island or in Westchester County or elsewhere in Connecticut as well. So our investment model prefers that we are purchasing property and developing it when entitlements are in place and we have much more clarity as to what the development is going to cost to develop and confidence about the returns that it will generate. And in New York City, that set of metrics doesn't always exist. And so we've been really, really successful developing outside of New York City, and New York City has not been a primary focus. I would say, though, looking forward, New York City will actually be a greater focus for Mill Creek. Maybe not necessarily in Manhattan, but certainly in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island.
Okay, let me pose the next question to Joe. I mean, the master development plan, let's talk about what RXR became the master developer and what its effect has done for RXR and other developers who've been building in New Rochelle.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mike, for having us on today. I think the New Rochelle Master Development Agreement that RXR worked on with the city of New Rochelle back in 2014 and 2015 really set the tone for public-private partnerships in Westchester County and a lot of the outer boroughs, and in particular, the suburban market. As we went through that rezoning with the city of New Rochelle, what we quickly realized was there was an absolute need for additional suburban housing in these metro areas, in particular places like New Rochelle that are very transit oriented, very close to attractions in Westchester County, but very close in proximity to Manhattan. And through that partnership with the city, many of us are developing in New Rochelle presently. We've had a lot of success in New Rochelle with our first development at 360 Huguenot, and we have another development that will come to market in the first quarter of next year, followed by a handful of other sites that we're working on. And I think that opportunity to grow within the city of New Rochelle and other municipalities, and that hand-in-hand process with local government has made a tremendous success for both RXR and other developers. And to Russell's point earlier, we found it a lot easier to navigate through the channels in these smaller municipalities than you would be able to in places like New York City. And I think there's an opportunity there for both developers and the community to capitalize on those opportunities and bring housing for all in these municipalities. And that means market rate housing, Michael, and that also means affordable housing. And we've been in that space as well.
Let's bring up the subject of affordable housing because, you know, New York City doesn't have enough affordable housing, and definitely Westchester doesn't. Are there requirements, Greg and Russell and Joe, in certain of the communities to build a portion of the units affordable?
In New Rochelle, a certain percentage of the apartment homes that we develop are affordable at a certain percentage of AMI. And we strongly believe that that's an important aspect of new developments in the New York Metro and frankly throughout the country. To be able to provide housing, which is so undersupplied throughout the country and in our area, but to supply housing that meets a wide range of income levels and family types is really important to us. And so there is a percentage of the homes that are affordable. Sometimes it ranges anywhere from 10 to as high as 20% of a community.
Yeah, we always see affordable requirements. I think that the trend that we're seeing, though, is that a lot of municipalities are becoming more aggressive with their asks. And in a lot of cases, these more aggressive requirements, say, in the example of Yonkers, which came up somewhat recently, they wanted to go from a 10% mandate to a 20% mandate, but there was no offsetting tax breaks or anything else to help offset that. And Stanford recently increased their affordable mandate to 10%. So, you know, what happens when you see those requirements increasing is that without some sort of other offsetting factors, in a lot of cases that can blow up a deal. I mean, that can make a development not economically viable. So instead of getting more affordable housing, they get zero affordable housing, and for that matter, zero market rate housing unless it's done in a smart way. And I think that in the case that came up recently in Yonkers, thankfully, the mayor had the foresight to veto the legislation that the city council put forward. But you know, you're seeing this crop up all over the place, whether it's New Jersey, Northern New Jersey, Westchester, Fairfield, whatever. It's becoming more and more common. And I think that the municipalities need to understand the math behind how these things work. I'm also the co-chair of the ULI Westchester Fairfield District Council. And one of the things that we do is we put on a program on a somewhat regular basis called Urban Plan. And one of the things that we do through that is it's sort of a workshop for public officials where they are really provided with financial models and they can see very directly the impact of layering on all of these additional requirements onto the developments and how it can make them infeasible. So I think it's important for everybody to recognize that that you know everything has to stay somewhat in balance in order to make these deals work.
So I'm going to go to the banker right now. Listening to the discussion and reviewing the websites, it seems to me that White Plains, Yonkers, New Rochelle, and Stanford are the major cities of interest of all four people. As a banker, how do you make a determination which community you're interested in lending to?
Yeah, that's a good question. And ultimately, market selection is, a component of what we look at. Obviously, sponsorship is very critical to us in terms of both, their experience more broadly and in those markets. And as you start thinking about, I think an interesting point around, let's say, Westchester, you look at the institutional ownership of that and sort of transaction volume in that market. That was maybe single digits about 5 years ago. That's maybe half of what's made up in that market. So you sort of follow kind of a old cliche, but kind of follow the money with where the larger players are writing their checks, and look to that as some level of comfort. But in addition, I think the fact around sort of transit orientation, there's also, I think, a point Russell made as well, is how does that market stand on its own with respect to both connectivity to the nearby suburbs where perhaps some of these tenants either came from or hope to move to, as well as other forms of employment. So I think obviously in Westchester, the healthcare system and other sort of employers certainly increasing the appetite. So I think a lot of that goes into our decision making. I wouldn't say there's any one market that is above the rest. I think it comes down to like the economics of the project, the sponsorship, and how we sort of forecast the market.
What are the rents compared White Plains, Yonkers, New Rochelle, and then to Jersey City? Even though I'm going to the other state, since you guys are involved with Jersey City, how do you compare the rental rates? And then the next question is, how long is it taking you today to rent up the property?
Well, I'll say that we've seen leasing activity pick up substantially, starting, call it over the last 4 months roughly. We've seen the absorption rate in new deals go up fairly dramatically. In Stamford, as an example, I know some of the properties that are in lease up right now, whereas we would have expected ordinarily to see 20 to 25 units per month, we're seeing 40 to 45 units per month. So it's really pretty encouraging from what we're seeing, and I think that that's pretty consistent across markets, and I think that it is creating rent growth as well. I mean, we're seeing different properties able to push pricing.
I would say that clearly the pandemic had a major impact on rent growth over the past year and a half or so. But fast forward to now, rent growth is meaningful. Prospective residents acknowledge that the worries of the pandemic are far less than they used to be, and are now more considering more a change of home experience. And so, since many of the communities that we develop are for those that want to rent by choice rather than by necessity, delivering a home experience that is highly amenitized and is well located is really important, and can achieve rent premiums that other communities might not. So we've seen considerably more leasing activity at all of our communities. And I would also say that it's a bit of a balancing act as to how quickly a community leases up, because one strategy could be heads on beds. You are competing with many other developers that are all delivering new communities at the same time, and you want to not be lagging in the market. And so you might control your rent growth in order to get more new residents in your community. And on the flip side, you might be the only new game in town where there's a lot of demand for your apartments, and you want to control the occupancy through growing your rents. And we've employed both of those strategies and hybrids of both of those strategies, depending upon what the local condition is of the market. To lease 40 or 50 or 60 apartments a month for a community that might be, somewhere between 400 and 550 apartments might be really important, because you don't want to lease a building in such a fashion whereby you are through your first initial lease year and you are still leasing the new community while you have existing new residents renewing their lease. So
Here's a
it's a balancing act.
here's a question. What's the profile of a person who's renting? What's the age profile? Where do they work? The situation. Are they working in Connecticut or Westchester? Are they working in Manhattan? Are they single? Are they families? What do you have there?
So with what we're seeing at the RXR properties, in particular in Fairfield County in Stamford, is you have a, a much higher median age than you do in some of our Westchester product. And I think a lot of that has to do with this influx of folks that were moving out of Manhattan and actually looking for single family homes in Fairfield County. Single family home sales in Fairfield County have skyrocketed over the last 12 months. And what we've seen is an influx of empty nesters selling their single family homes and downsizing and moving into our apartment building in Stamford, Connecticut. And the typical profile of those empty nesters are somewhere in their mid 50s to 60s. Their children have gone off to college or have since graduated from college and are living on their own in either Westchester, Fairfield, or New York City or other parts of the country. And they're working locally in either Stamford or somewhere in Fairfield County, whether it's New Haven or actually going down into Manhattan. So you're seeing that older demographic living in Fairfield County, where what we're seeing in places like New Rochelle and Yonkers are the younger professionals, the young families. Maybe they're a couple with their first child, an infant child or toddler age children moving out of Manhattan and into the suburban market with easy access to New York City, but perhaps at a different price point and at a different point in their life where access to outdoors might not be as important to them, but having more space and the flexibility is important to them. As Greg mentioned, what we're seeing in Stamford with respect to rents and absorption is just phenomenal at our product at Atlantic Station West, where we're seeing 40 to 45 units absorbed on a monthly basis. And I think that has a lot to do with the supply in some of these markets, where we're seeing rents slightly lower than White Plains in places like New Rochelle, and even slightly less in places like Yonkers as a result of the supply in those markets. We're fortunate enough to have one of the only new products in New Rochelle present day, and I think that we've set the market in New Rochelle for that renter profile. And you'll see renters in those buildings in whether it's Yonkers or New Rochelle in the healthcare professions or financial space, working in either Greenwich, Connecticut, or Westchester or Manhattan.
Russell?
The amazing factoid that I've learned over the years is that we all look to develop transit-oriented communities that are close to the train and access to the city. And there is an enormous percentage of our residents that do not get on the train. And it could be as high as 50% or more. We have such a untapped pool of middle and higher income prospective residents in the New York metro area that don't necessarily work in New York City. They work on the Gold Coast of, they live on the Gold Coast or work on the Gold Coast in northern New Jersey. People that live on Long Island have lived there their entire lives and don't want to leave Long Island. And so they also work on Long Island. There are plenty of people that get on the train too, but being transit oriented is really important, but it is not necessary. That's why I and Greg and Joe are also developing in suburban markets that aren't right next door to a train.
In places like White Plains and Stamford as well, you have a fair number of residents who don't even work in those cities. They're actually commuting out and driving to the surrounding areas for their jobs, but they want to be a part of those urban suburban locales to really be able to take advantage of the lifestyle, whether it's the restaurant and bar scene, social scene, that's where their friends are, whatever. But some of these municipalities have developed enough center of gravity that it actually draws, it draws people in, and they want to be a part of that. So I think that's a trend that will continue.
One last question. Are we seeing any other towns like Hastings on the Hudson, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, other cities where there's new development taking place in Westchester?
There's Sleepy Hollow, for an example, Bronxville. And there's lots of communities in Westchester County that would like to see more development occur. And I think they are looking very closely, Port Chester is another example. I think they're looking very closely at the model that New Rochelle has created for permitting development in a thoughtful way that is that promotes fiscal growth without compromising the infrastructure that exists in their community.
As I always like with my crystal apple over here, it looks bright for the Westchester Stanford development. And I think people are definitely going to be moving to properties owned and operated by the individuals here. I'd like to thank Greg, Joe, Privy, and Russell, and I'll see you next week.